Wonderful. So welcome everyone. Just like to let you know that the session's being recorded, so feel free to turn off your camera if you don't want your face recorded and leave yourself on mute so we get nice clear sound quality. I'll just introduce myself first. So my name is Jasmine Barrett and I'm a PhD student at the University of Melbourne. I'm researching disability in North Korea. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm coming from. That's the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. Also the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners of the land on which the University of Melbourne stands. I'd now like to hand it over to Associate Professor Dr. Jae Song, who will offer some welcoming remarks. Thanks, Jae.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. This is all I have to say. I would just like to welcome everyone for this lovely evening. I am actually connecting from Canberra today, but we are very privileged to have Dr. Bernhard today to talk about a rather unusual and rare opportunity to hear about the biodiversity on the entire Korean Peninsula, but especially on the demilitarized zone. And I've been following him on Facebook for a long time. I became a fan of his work and his organization and his own sort of acts of bird watching around the Korean Peninsula. So I'm really looking forward to learning about the topic and really, looking forward to the discussions afterward. We also heard today the North Korean government has admitted that they have Omicron cases. So if we have some more time, we can also talk about those recent developments in North Korea as well. So thank you and welcome everyone again. Now back to Jasmine.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm so excited to have Bernhard here to speak with us today because bird watching, as you said, I think it got a big boost when we were all in lockdown over the past 2 years. I've really started to appreciate nature more and especially bird watching. So yeah, really looking forward to hearing more about that. But let me properly introduce our wonderful speaker today. So Dr. Bernhard Seliger has been the representative of the Hans Seidler Foundation in Korea since 2002. He frequently travels to North Korea, implementing capacity building projects, among others, in forestry and biodiversity, as well as healthcare. He also serves as associate editor of the North Korean Review. He's worked as a professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies and Seoul National University and earned a habilitation in economics at the University of Witten-Herdecke and a doctorate from Kiel University in Germany. So thank you very much. I'll hand over to you now, Dr. Seliger. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And yeah, 2 remarks first. First of all, you are right. Bird watching is a fun part of the work we do, but I rather not like to call it bird watching too much because my boss might get a wrong idea of what we are doing here. So I speak of biodiversity, but it's absolutely true. Part of it are the surveys, and they are really fascinating. And I hope I can show you some of that in the presentation, which I will share with you in a minute. And the second one, as you said, today, it's the Omicron day, which it's a very double-edged word. I'm really worried about North Korea, our partners, a country which is completely unvaccinated, basically, for all we know. It could be very devastating because the North Koreans themselves always said we closed down our country in 2002 because we cannot handle such a crisis internally. Our health system is not able to that. That's what they said themselves. Now they admit they have Omicron. And the other thing then, a little bit silver line of hope, maybe that they announced it, they admitted it, and that might be a way they say, let us talk about it, because they had talks with COVAX, they twice rejected vaccines actually in the past. Now that might be at least a new approach to do so. But now let's talk about the topic of the day, and to do so, I will share my presentation with you. It's a very long one. Not sure if I can talk about all here, but I try to get through it. Can you see it? Okay, okay. So I want to talk really about biodiversity on the peninsula, and in particular the border area. Try to go to front, but I cannot move my presentation. I don't know why. Oh, there it is. It was too fast. Okay, I will first talk a little bit about species and habitats in North and South Korea, then about doing research on wild animals, and then about why we do cooperation in wetlands and nature protection. Because in a day like today, I sent an email to our partner, the Ministry of Environment, some related topics, and clearly you feel, is that a priority in a country where other things, be it the military development, the nuclear development, be it human rights, be it the humanitarian situation, the medical situation, might be very, very important. But I hope I can show why this work is also not so unimportant. Some general considerations. Korea is quite interesting, the whole peninsula, due to all these different climate zones they have. You see here from the Paektu sun, which is basically sub-arctic, to Jeju, which is subtropical, and the southern edge of the peninsula, you have a variety of climate zones, and that has very strong influence on the fauna. You see here at the top, you see the white-tailed eagle, a winter visitor in South Korea, and in the summer now breeding somewhere in Russia, northern China, Mongolia, or to Alaska. And then you have birds like here, the black-capped kingfisher or the tiger shrike coming only as summer visitors, making Korean Peninsula a country where 90% of bird species are migratory. In Europe, it's roughly half, 50 to 60%. We have much more birds which are there all year. They exist here. Pheasants, sparrows, some pigeons, but most of the species are very different. So I do a lot of birding on the borderline between North and South Korea, this big black line here. And when I go out now, I see totally different species than 3-4 months ago. That makes it, first of all, very interesting. Second consideration, the flyways. We have the whole world, we could say, in various flyways. And as you can see, Australia together with Korea, with parts of China, and up to northern Russia and Alaska, it's part of the East Asian Australasian Flyway. And that means birds are migrating along this flyway up and down. And a very interesting point is the Yellow Sea area, because in the Yellow Sea area, we have a kind of bottleneck where every year, twice a year, millions of birds go through. And we have South Korea, China, Japan, highly developed countries, which already achieved to destroy most of its tidal flats. I think I will talk about that later for South Korea, but just as a fact which I find staggering, that in the last 50 years, South Korea lost 75% of its tidal flat due to reclamation. And then we have North Korea, which would have done the same if they could, but since they work mostly manually, they were much slower in reclamation. It's the only country where reclamation goes on now, but it has been a very slow pace, and that means we have here very, very important grounds for feeding for many birds, which do not exist anymore elsewhere in the Yellow Sea area. Third consideration, let's think about agriculture. You see here the Monegi, the rice plantation. It's ongoing now. South Korea did it mostly already because they do it not manually, but by machines. Is that good or bad? First of all, we can say the way North Korea does agriculture resembles the way South Korea did the same 60 years ago. An abundant life of insects, because very few pesticides, means also an abundant bird life. On the other hand, think of a big bird like the crane. Behind me on my screen, you see here that is the hooded crane in Suncheon in South Korea, flying away north. And if you think of these birds, They don't like North Korea. Why not? If they come there, the rice fields are completely empty because people are gleaning. You know, maybe the picture of Millet, the gleaners, these women who are taking away the rest of the harvest after the official harvesting once done. This is done all the time in North Korea. People walk through the fields all the time in North Korea. There's no hunting going on practically because they have no arms for that, a little bit of netting, but not really serious. But the disturbance level is rather high. So it's all, have to see various sides. Let's look at deforestation. Terrible deforestation in North Korea. We had 80% forests. Half of these are now seriously degraded or completely disappeared. And that's a big problem. But again, there are some birds who like that. Larks, skylarks, which are becoming very rare here in South Korea because the meadows are missing. They love this territory, certain forms of types of buntings, etc. But on the whole, it's disastrous for people, it's disastrous for climate, it leads to flooding and drought, so it's a very bad development. And we see that here we have a lot of drought, and partly this drought is made internationally, so to speak. It's the effect of climate change. We have every year in Gangwon-do, you see here the picture below, rivers which are drying out. The picture on the top is, I think, in Rason. There's this pre-planted rice, but already no water inside because it was too dry, so it will die very soon. Partly, however, it's also a man-made problem in North Korea that watershed management doesn't work. If there are no trees, the water rushes down the mountain and disappears then, and it's not there when it's needed. So that's one of the reasons why we are so strongly focusing on forestation also, because it saves lives and it saves the agriculture. If you look at South Korea, we have the terrible industrialization of the countryside. South Koreans really love their construction sector so much. So they built, this is in near Paektu, the upper right-hand picture. There are 3 roads in a distance of less than 500 meters, 3 new big roads built through very sensitive habitats. Sometimes it's really, it can only desperate how these habitats, this river is a Gongneung-chong, very near also to Jeju, how these habitats there disappear. And look at this picture. This is a new normal in South Korea in rice fields. You build trenches which are very, very steep, which allow for very fast flow of water, but which are death traps for amphibia, reptilia, small mammals. And this is one of the most serious problems. The countryside becomes completely empty. You see here how it looks in a traditional river side or trench side, how it should look, and you see in front how it looks today. Can you imagine how, yeah, let's say a frog or a small mammal can crawl over these trenches? It's impossible. And that's an ongoing process. This is also very sensitive territory. It's a Siam wetland close to the border. And nevertheless, the government pours, that is a rural construction company, pours millions into the development of these trenches, new roads, because it makes to some extent the work of farmers easier. Yields are not really increasing a lot by that, but biodiversity is shrinking year by year. And this is how it should look like, the river. This is still a better example, an older trend, but the worst one is really this picture. Finally, tidal flood reclamation. I said already, a number of endangered birds, like spoon-billed sandpiper, one of the rarest birds in the world, is maybe only 200 or 300 surviving, has been very hard hit by tidal flood reclamation, and 75% of the historic area has been lost. Okay, I said already about the massive infrastructure development. That's really a topic I like to talk about. And finally, how can we explain this? One of the reasons is that South Korea is one of the most densely populated countries in the world. Actually, it is for those countries which are not city-states, which like Hong Kong or Singapore, it's I think the third most densely populated country of the world. And this explains clearly the pressure which is put on the environment. It's much better in North Korea. The per capita density of population is only half of that than South Korea. It's still rather densely populated, comparable to Europe, to Germany, for example, but not as crazy as South Korea. On the southern side, as you mostly know, I guess, since the 1960s, we had afforestation, first under an authoritarian government and later democratic government. We have now healthy forests. And we can say that like in Europe, not sure about the situation in Australia, but like in Europe, the forest bird populations are very healthy and thriving, but the agricultural bird populations are crushing. Okay, we talked about that. The forests are degraded in the northern part. Now, why is it interesting to focus on birds? One interesting reason is that birds are bioindicators. For example, we have these two birds. One is the tiger shrike. It's a bird which practically disappeared in South Korea. You find it only in the DMZ area, or when I talk about the DMZ, it's really the civilian control zone. That is the zone you can enter there. And in North Korea. In North Korea, they have a healthy population. So you can ask what is the reason for that. Main reason is they live from insects, so insect life. What is the reason for that? The way they do agriculture. So we have a very interesting chain here, and we have consequences. So if you think of how agriculture in North Korea should develop, because there should be development. North Koreans need to develop their agriculture, but maybe they can do it in a different way than South Korea. On the right hand, it's a light-vented bulbul. It's a bird which didn't exist on the Korean Peninsula 30 years ago. It's a very frequent bird actually in China. And this is probably due to climate change that they moved north. And we were the first to see them 2017 or 18 in North Korea. They hadn't been reported before there, but now they are regular. Let's talk a little bit about certain species. We have a red data book in North Korea of DPRK. It's actually some of the data there is historic, meaning they say we had this or that animal, the tiger or so, and it has been seen until the 1960s or until the 1950s. So the data is not, let's say, very, very up to date and accurate, but it gives you some idea. And to look at some of these species, large mammals, the tiger, I might say later a few words on that. We know that sometimes tigers cross into the country from the frozen Tumen River, but not much more is known about that. Or the bear, brown bear and black bear. Brown bear and black bear. Both of them are said to be found in places like Ogasan, Kumgansan, Paektu-san, but here also we don't know many things. We know that the black bear has been seen on the borderline by a nighttime camera by South Korean soldiers. I think 2 years ago, a black bear was a young one, so they might be there more frequently. Brown bears, don't know about any recent really observation which can be validated. One of my favorites, the white-bellied woodpecker. It's a knakse in Korean. I don't know, one or the other might know this name. It's the kind of bird endemic to the peninsula, and probably it's not really related to the Tryocopus javensis. And so there is one of them in Southeast Asia, but probably by genetic analysis, if we could do it, we would find out it's a different species and it would be then an endemic species to the peninsula, last been seen around 20 years ago in the Kaesong area. We don't know if it still exists. The forests where it was seen, they don't exist anymore. They have been by now cut down, but there might be remnants of the population in certain parts of the DMZ. I long time planned to do a research on that one, but unfortunately COVID prevented us for now going there. The bustard, it has been in North Korea regularly on Oncheon, so that's on the west coast. It disappeared. We had 3 years ago a bustard in South Korea, a single one. It was hunted down by bird photographers. That's one of these tragic incidences. Koreans love birds, especially they like to go there with big cameras and photograph them. And they did it so long until the bird basically, because it was always flushed, died from exhaustion. Or the black grouse, and the crested shelduck. That's an interesting one because it has been a frequent bird 300 years ago. It was sold in markets, obviously in Japan. And then from the modern times, from the last 100 years, we only know 2 or 3 of them, which were caught in Incheon, some of them. And the last site, according to North Korean sources, was in the 1960s, somewhere in the Chilbosan area of the sea, of the East Sea. It's very difficult to ascertain that. So a lot of research could still be done. We'll not go through all of this because I don't think I have time for that, but I would like to say there has been research on birds in the Korean Peninsula around 150 years ago. It started in the 1860s, and we had a number of quite famous researchers. Among them, this one whom I like really a lot was called Four-Eyed Nenuni, because he was obviously so good in recognizing the birds. One famous researcher was Jankowski, and these people had all a very fascinating history. If you go inside, he was a Polish, I think, aristocrat who had to leave his country. So there were quite a lot of people roaming the area and trying to find out about bird life. By the way, in old times, mostly they did it by collecting the bird, meaning they shot them. They didn't have so good camera, and they had no cameras, and they didn't have so good binoculars, so they shot them. And you would be shocked to see in modern times it still exists. There's an article about, I think, bird in Central America. There's a kind of blue macaw or something. What was it? And this article, and then he collected it. So somebody found that bird after a very long time back. Then he started to have the proof to have it. Now this disappears with more ethical research. Fortunately, we don't do that. And there was a very interesting family of bird researchers, actually. Dr. Won Hong-woo in North Korea came from Incheon, and through the war he was drifted to North Korea and ended up in Pyongyang and became the kind of father of bird research in North Korea. And ironically, his son, who stayed in South Korea, became the most famous bird researcher in South Korea. They didn't know they still live each other. And finally, the son found out about his father, but he was never able to meet him again. It was not possible in that time, in the 1960s. And another ironic thing is that though father and son did most of the research in South and North Korea respectively, if you look at bird names, you will find that 50% of bird names are different, and sometimes completely different, which also shows something about how these societies slowly drift away. Another famous researcher, Chung Jong-yeol, he's a North Korean from the North Korean minority in Japan, worked there at the Chosun University and did a lot in the 1980s to start raising awareness on certain birds like the black-faced spoonbill, which is another iconic bird of the peninsula, if you want so, and who also introduced the first wetland inventory of North Korea. There was a Polish researcher, Tomek, and the German one, Fiebig, who had chance to work in North Korea. Fiebig was the husband of an East German diplomat, and in the 1980s could be in North Korea in a time when still the country was more open for travel for foreigners than today. Okay, and they also did something like looking for this now extinct crested shell duck, but didn't find it. Then there was a very important time in the early 1990s when North Korea first opened up for humanitarian aid due to its dire situation. In that time, also the GEF, the Global Environmental Facility, came into the country, and some first biosphere reserve projects were done, especially in Moyansan, and also the first ideas for better protection of the West Coast were issued. But all of this ended 10 years later, around 2003, 4, 5, when North Korea embarked on its nuclear policy, and then all environmental projects were basically put on a hold. And then we restarted from 2013-14 with UNESCO, Hans Seidel Foundation and Birds Korea. We started with the first survey in North Korea and had a seminar there. And from that on, quite rapidly, we could fortunately come to some interesting cooperation with the Ministry of Land and Environment Protection, so the Ministry of Environment of North Korea. Now, why did we work on wetlands? As I said, it's really great fun to do bird research and bird watching, but that was not the reason. But because wetlands are not only important for biodiversity, but also for the livelihood of people and for climate change mitigation. North Korea has already a long history of nature protection, but the implementation clearly was problematic. I was in 2011 in a place near Jeju, Gangneung. There's a protected area for cranes, which are also symbol birds for Korea, the Manchurian or red-crowned crane. And that time, the rangers told me that in the early 1990s, Kim Il-sung himself, before he died, said the rangers had to hand in all their arms. They had, I don't know, firearms. And because he said, we are now in a time of famine, and there will be invariably clashes of the people, because people started to illegally hunt, illegally fish, especially in these protected areas. And he didn't want that this leads to deadly clashes. So in a way, the implementation is often very difficult. For us, another reason to work on wetlands is that this is one of the very few areas where international cooperation with North Korea is possible. And we think that it's important for North Korea kind of to learn about international peaceful interaction. If you think of a North Korean diplomat, let's say in Geneva, 90% of his work is related to nuclear or human rights questions, which is good. They have to be exposed to that, but that cannot be all. They don't really know, they feel, or they always say we live in a hostile environment. They don't really know how peaceful cooperation could work. And we think, because North Korea is not a monolithic state, it looks like one, but it's not so that only the guy on the top does the decisions. There are various stakeholders, there are various power groups or pressure groups, and we believe, for example, very concretely, that the people in our ministry, if they are empowered, if they can learn how international cooperation brings some benefits, they can do better decisions in this very important field. So we had two goals, especially, namely to bring North Korea into the Flyway Partnership and into the Ramsar Convention. Both of them succeeded. Also, the Ministry of Environment became member of IUCN, which was also very fruitful, we think. And to do so, North Korea had to fulfill a number of criteria, which was for us very good, we think. We did a lot of capacity building, trainings, workshops. You see here we had a workshop in Kumgangsan in the so-called Hyundai Family Hotel, which is on the left bottom. That is one of the hotels which North Korea now wants to tear down. We had national workshops, so-called in Pyongyang, like here in the middle, and exhibitions. And we did surveys, especially on the East Coast. That was very important, we think, because it allowed us to know much more about wetlands of North Korea, and it gave them also an incentive to do their own surveys for creating a new wetland inventory, because that was one of the important works they had to do to become a member of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. I'm now assuming that all of you know these organizations, but probably I assumed too much. So once more, go back a little. The Ramsar Convention, it's not a UN organization, but with now 170 members, it's a quasi-international, really all-encompassing organization on the protection of wetlands, named after a place in Iran, where in the 1970s, the first conference took place in these wetlands. The Flyway Partnership, East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership, is an organization or partnership for the flyway in which now 18 countries, and I think currently around 20 NGOs are together. I think it's so-called Type 2 organization under the Kyoto Protocol. And that means this organization works on providing a safe flyway for the birds in this area. Okay, what did we want to achieve? A reintegration of North Korea into international environmental networks, capacity building, and then the establishment of Ramsar sites, which was also a precondition. Every country which wants to adhere to the Ramsar Convention needs at least to develop one Ramsar site, and also so-called flyway sites for the flyway. We did a lot of training in the country and also abroad on topics like wetland management, sustainable fisheries, ecosystem services, etc. And one additional bonus which we found very important was that as soon as we were out of the country, let's say if we had meetings in China or in other places, often we could also have north-south contacts as part of that. And as I said, one of the goals was to create a wetland inventory. We have a very, very interesting document now, which was published. It's a Ramsar COP in October 2018. The second wetland inventory after 120 years earlier, which describes 54 coastal, inland, and artificial wetlands, listing, for example, what the fauna there, what's the flora there, what the water conditions are there, etc. That's what we think a major contribution, and many people and organizations like WWF, Hong Kong Birdwatching Society, and also Hans Seidel Foundation helped to compile this and to print this. And it was for us very interesting because it was also for the first time possible to have information about the sites in the inner Korean border area, which were usually also for our partners not accessible because it's in North Korea, a military area. So we think that these new responsibilities which North Korea has, like maintaining flyway sites, is very important. You see here the network of important sites, and some of them are already on the peninsula, and you see how heavily these sites are concentrated in the Yellow Sea area. As I said, international cooperation was for this very important, and we brought the North Koreans to a number of workshops abroad, like here one on very rare duck, the bear spotted, and all of this often allowed us also to arrange North-South meetings, like you see here on the right lower end, where we have the head of this working group together with the North and South Korean representative. That's one of the reasons we work on this. We see this also as a way of peace building or building trust between both sides. I will skip this part because I talked already about it and have not too much time, just to give you some ideas what we could achieve in the surveys. Basically, we can say that for roughly 60 or 70 years in that area had been none or very, very few surveys, because North Korea, they had their bird researchers and they focused on a few sites, but many were simply not seen. So, for example, in the summer bird survey, we found evidence of breeding of species which had never seen before being breeding on the Korean Peninsula, because basically it was thought they are moving further to the north, like this duck, the Gatwell, or grebes, Eurasian bittern, etc. Or we found renewed evidence, like the northern lapwing, which had been seen breeding by Jankowski in 1898, and from that time on, not anymore on the Korean Peninsula. However, there's also challenges. Very clearly, North Korea wants to develop. And for us, it might look very romantic if you see an ox cart going by, if you see these small houses in the countryside, if you have all this amazing bird life, but living there is not very romantic. And we should be very clear, the North Koreans always will choose economic development over environmental protection, like South Korea choose to do so. So what can we do? One point would be to say, if we could establish a good system of ecotourism to attract attention and gain international recognition and generate income, that might be one way in which North Korea could get more interested protecting these areas. But it's certainly an uphill battle, like in every other country too. Now, there are some good points. As you said in the beginning, the interest in bird watching is increasing. And we have now, for example, in China, a market of 2 to 3 million people at least doing bird watching and spending a lot of money. They're all in the upper income strata. They spend money on equipment, on traveling, etc. Now, North Korea is not very interesting, let's say, for European bird watchers. It is interesting, but not species-wise, let's say. They could go to Japan, to northern Japan, or they could go to Russia, where they would find the same species in greater abundance often. But for the Chinese, it's an ideal place, because here they have species on the East Coast which they cannot observe in their own country. And at the same time, it's logistically, price-wise, and also culturally quite near to their own country. So we have really here a big market, and we tried twice in 2018 and 2019 to arrange tours. Actually, we did so with Hong Kong Bird Watching Society and Shanghai Bird Watching Society, but then COVID came, so this program is on hold now. We work with the North Koreans to develop bird festivals, etc. There are other threats, like this very new aquaculture company, which is built, unfortunately, in mid of the most productive lagoon lake of North Korea. And so we try really to work hard, but we are not sure if we can succeed. One way to increase the interest would be to work on, for example, on local bird festival, like a swan festival in the area. Clearly, there has to be financial means for that. Sanctions are a problem now. So there are a number of challenges anyway, plus the corona situation. And one of our hopes is to one day establish a wetland center in Rason, but that has to wait for the time being. Rason is especially exciting in late autumn, but especially in early spring when swans gathering there, and we have thousands of swans, among them mute swans. You see here on below, which are the common swan in Europe, but which are very, very rare in East Asia, and therefore many East Asian bird watchers really target species to see. They are wild swans coming from Russia and then resting there for some time. I have to skip the moondog part for now, I think. So it's also very interesting, but then I cannot go through with my presentation anymore. Now I want to talk for the last part a little bit about wildlife along the DMZ. This is a view from the so-called Ice Cream Hill in South Korea, in Cholon. Ice Cream Hill because in the Korean War, that hill melted like ice cream through bombing. It's actually a very sad name if you think of that. And on top of that hill, there is there's a bunker, and that bunker in the maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, South Korean local government had the idea, okay, because we don't use it every day for military purpose, luckily, we can do it at the same time for bird watching. And it was all prepared, and then the landowner said, no, we don't want that. If bird watchers come, there will be more regulations, there will be more protection. So what you see here is actually the plains, the rice field area of Cholon, and in the back you see North Korea. There's a white building you can see a little bit here. That is a observatory, and behind that is North Korea. And every morning the cranes, white-naped cranes and red-crowned cranes coming into the rice fields and feeding there. They're roosting on the North Korean side, which is less disturbed, and then feed on the South Korean side. But here you see one problem. Landowners are not interested necessarily in protecting this area. It was well protected as long as it was part of the civilian control zone. But those parts which have recently been released from this military control are now developed very rapidly with hothouses, etc. So here we have a number of species which can be only or mainly found in that border area. Big ones like the cranes, or like the vultures, Cinereus vulture, or like the eagles, but also small ones like shrikes, bitterns, nightjars, etc. It's really, you go from the one part, let's say in Kosong, which is on the east coast, you go from the non-protected part, you drive into this protected area, and it's completely different, the wildlife. It's really interesting to see. And it includes also breeding, like mandarin ducks, dollar birds, etc. So we have really here very, very important area. And ecotourism, as I said, is increasing also in South Korea, but the relaxation of the rules, that is that there's less military, threatens the remaining habitats, and also some, I don't know why, unfortunate thinking about how wetlands should look like. Korean landscape planners, most of them were educated in America or in Europe, I fear. They think a wetland should look like a park. You should go through on your city shoes, naturally not wet, but dry. And they build structures like this amphitheater here on the upper right picture. It's part of the Wajimpo Lagoon Lake. The lake is quite famous because it was, among others, pictured in one of the first very successful K-pop series, K-dramas, Winter Sonata, with Yonsama. I don't know, you will still remember that, some of you. And then maybe 5 years ago, the local government had got $2 million to make the wetland more beautiful. And what they did, all the valuable areas, which were reedbed areas, a little dirty and a little smelly, but very productive for birds, they all disappeared. Now we have broad ways to walk through. We have nice photo places, and no birds anymore. So that's a very sad one. There are ways to cope with that to some extent. For example, if you look at the trenches, you can build frog ladders. We started in several places, very simple structures, like a little bit of meshed wire where the frogs can actually climb up. Frogs are good climbers. These very deep trenches, but it's unfortunately not enough for now. We did it in 1 or 2 places as model projects, but every year thousands of new kilometers of these trenches are built. There would be a way, like we have it in Europe, we try to bring it to Korea, a kind of contractual protection of nature, where farmers are paid for ecosystem services or for a certain way how to treat the environment. And this could really be good for rice fields. For example, there's a way we had one model project where the local government paid money that the rice field is the whole year underwater. This is very, very important for the fauna and flora of the area, but less convenient for the farmers who have to do their ploughing then underwater. It's possible, but less convenient. So, but the farmers were paid some money to do so, and it was quite a good success in terms of the birds, which were then able to thrive on these areas. Is cooperation with North Korea possible? Basically, it's very, very difficult. South Koreans do really many things to come to this, but it's not easy. There might be some ways, I skip now over something, to cooperate. And the wetland inventory was one way where we could see that if you do it rightly in an international context, North Korea could provide information on very sensitive areas, including maps, including data, which was very, very helpful. Last, I want to present this one. Maybe that is Taekumgang. So that's Kumgang Sun in the sea. From the North Korean side, in the background, it's already South Korea. And it's really interesting. This area hosts a lot of cormorants, pelagic and temmings and great cormorants. And every day they fly from North Korea to South Korea, because in the North Korean side, they are completely undisturbed. There's almost no fishing going on, and no tourists, nothing. But on the South Korean side, they find much easier possibilities to feed, because South Korea is full of fishermen, of aquaculture. Fishermen throw away enormous amounts of what they consider waste parts of the fish they don't need. They just put into the sea again. And the aquaculture allows the cormorants to sit on these structures, to feed on these structures. So here you see really that we have a biodiversity connection on the peninsula. And that would be another point where cooperation could go on. I think I'm through with my time now, so I have to skip the rest here, but I'm really very happy to discuss it then in the discussion with you. And I hope it was interesting for you, and I'm really looking forward to any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's one of the most interesting talks I've ever heard. It's really fascinating. Can I start with a question, Jasmine? Would you allow me to?
Yeah, go
Yes.
ahead, please.
I was very envious of the birds who can fly north and south without being stopped by those soldiers in the DMZ. I mean, the humans cannot, but the birds can. It's while listening to your presentation, I was thinking from Kim Jong-un's perspective, by cooperating with this international organization, governmental, non-governmental, or government-funded non-governmental organizations. You mentioned something about the economic development, some sort of incentives if they can attract some Chinese tourists coming for ecotourism. I also noticed that I wrote something about environmental migration, climate migration, sort of related topic. But since Kim Jong-un took power 2011, the government has been cooperating with the UN agencies on environmental protection, and they also enacted a law on environmental protection and other nature preservation. In your mind, what do you think it's North Korean leadership's minds, for cooperating with this particular areas, collaboration with international bodies?
That is a question we ask ourselves every day, because clearly there is a suspicion to say they only do it for the money. That one is not right. I mean, they do it for the money. Certainly there is a financial incentive. For example, we allow our partners to travel here or there where they couldn't travel alone. With the international meetings, it's usually, if it's an official one, let's say the Ramsar convention of the parties or the EAFP meeting of the parties, COP or MOP, then usually 1 or 2 places are sponsored by the organization itself. So by the Ramsar convention or so, they can go there. But there's a lot of meetings, trainings, etc., which we help them with that. That's our work. We are funded by the German government to do development work, and that's part of our work. And clearly also, if we do a seminar with them, before offline, now we do fortunately online seminars, we pay for certain things. Let's say we have a seminar on forestry. Foresters come from all over the country. They have to be housed in Pyongyang. So that's the same like in other countries we do that. Funny thing is, by the way, when they come from Rasom, they always say in Pyongyang, yeah, also the people from Rasom come. And we say, when do they come? Today or tomorrow, or maybe a day later. They don't really know, because the train network is not very reliable in that country. But anyway, so this is one incentive, but there's more than that. And the good proof is that in the time of pandemic, especially in the first year, when suddenly all our contact was, first of all, disrupted. We had still some email contact, but there was no more travel, etc. They continued and even extended some of their programs on their own. So they didn't do that for the money. For example, they did participate in an exercise which is called the Asian Waterbird Census, where in some day in January, all Asian countries count waterbirds. And they did that for the first time in 2020. We're very happy about it in last year and this year again. So you could see there, they had an intrinsic interest. They have another interest, and that is recognition. You cannot, as I said, if you are a normal North Korean diplomat, first of all, usually you never leave the country. We have a number of people speak excellent German, excellent English. I asked them, where did you learn it? Here in Pyongyang. Did you ever go out? Never. So especially for younger diplomats, it's very important to go out and to experience, to be in a situation where you are not the enemy, or where you are not representative of a rogue regime, but where they take you as you are, as a person working for the environment. It must be on a personal level, but I think also on an institutional level, very rewarding for them to be recognized. So when in 2017, the North Korea, before the change of government in South Korea, North Korea wanted to become part of the Flyway partnership, but South Korea said no. It was a consensual situation, and usually we have support here from South Korea. Even under Park Geun-hye, everything was good going there, because we also have back channels here, clearly, with the environmental organization, Ministry of Unification, etc. But there, the foreign ministry said, no, we don't want them. And it was a very heavy blow for our partner, because they lost faith. They went to Singapore to this meeting and hoped to become partner, and then South Korea said no. So the recognition aspect is another one. And then I think there is also some genuine interest in the environment, which has been there all the time as part of the, let's say, in socialist times. It came simply with the Soviet Union. They had this system of protected areas, of national symbols, national birds, etc. But it's also, I think, in some people I met, one or two, not, it's very difficult to meet North Koreans, but I know one bird researcher in Mundok who really lives there out of the way and does an incredibly good work with a very bad scope and binocular, but very good eyes. And really, these are people who are dedicated for their work. So I would say all of this plays a role. And now in the leadership is very difficult. Again, it's a mixture of different incentives, I would say. And also it's so small, it's not a topic Kim Jong-un will often talk about. He actually talked once about that. And I know that so well because every North Korean presentation has to start with a citation from the leader. And in our field, it's always the same one because it's the only one where he says we have to protect our animals and our plants very well. So he said that once at least, and that's good.
Great, thanks so much, Bernhard. I'm going to go to some more questions.